Members, the question is that the motion be agreed. Call the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the motion be amended by omitting the word now and adding this day 3 months. Mr. Speaker, I want to make it very clear that the Labour Party supports the Hobbit films being made in New Zealand. It is fantastic news for our film industry, our tourism industry, and it's very important for the economy. However, this has been totally mismanaged by the government, by John Key, and especially by the Honourable Jerry Brownlee. It is yet another example of how our relaxed Prime Minister has ignored what has been going on for nearly 2 years and then let it boil over into controversy and having to come in with a patch-up job. And a very, very expensive patch-up job at that. If the Minister in charge of this area, the Minister of Economic Development, was on top of the issues, he would have been able to see what was coming down the track. If he had regular meetings with Warners, as ministers before him did, and I say that they were mostly convivial meetings, but every now and again there was some tension as the issues were worked through. If the minister had done that, Mr. Speaker, then what we would have had is a sort of arrangement where people picked up the phone, where Jerry Brownlee and John Key stood beside Helen Kelly when the issue was sorted. When the issue was sorted, including by way of email from Warner Brothers on the 18th of October. That's when it was sorted. The industrial relations issues were sorted then. Mr. Speaker, I have heard Jerry Brownlee describe the $140,000 exercises on an annual basis as hungy and hooey. Hungy and hooey is how he described it. But those were the meetings that helped with the continuing investment of movies in New Zealand. And, sir, I think that is something which has been particularly useful to New Zealand. And I might say, sir, my only regret about being part of that is that I never actually got to go to the Oscars. It was one of those things was that the Oscars started, and I don't want to criticise Helen Clark, but she was not always very generous to me as far as travel was concerned. And at the point the Oscars started, I got on the plane to come home. But there are one or two stories which some members have heard, which I might tell in the committee stages, which are particularly interesting from that time. Now, I also want to ask Jerry Brownlee about Sir Peter Jackson and Sir Peter Jackson's review of the New Zealand Film Commission. Peter Jackson made some very good suggestions in that. And what has Jerry Brownlee done with them? What has he done with them? Can he remember receiving the report? But, sir, if he had focused on them, if he had focused on his job... Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Speaker, I know that I speak relatively loudly and sometimes interject a reasonable about myself, but, sir, there appears to be someone who has shifted their seat and is continually interjection, and I wonder, sir, whether I might have some protection from the chair.
Well, can I just say to the members that there was some interjection when the Honourable Kate Wilkinson was speaking. It was, I thought, reasonable, but I would have to make the observation the tenor and the tone has gone up subsequent to that. This is going to be a robust debate. There's going to be interjections. I just say to members that let's be reasonable about it. We want to have a free flow of debate, and just mindless shouting is going to be out. I call the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Speaker, I refer the members opposite in particular to the recommendations from Peter Jackson in his review about the importance of film incentives and getting them right. And so he is absolutely right in that, because every time we had a discussion in Hollywood with one of 3 or 4 studios on each occasion, we discussed the incentives, and they were adjusted and they were tweaked, and sometimes it cost us money and sometimes it didn't. Just things like the timing, the avoidance of foreign exchange risk. There were a lot of changes that occurred, but what we knew was that if there was an issue, both sides could pick up the phone. We talked regularly because we had a good relationship, although I say once or twice it wasn't quite as good. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about process as well. Labor received a copy of this bill at 12:40 today, despite promises from the Leader of the House that we would have it at 9:30 this morning. Sir, I want to say that in our time, an undertaking made by a minister was kept. If we undertook to supply a bill at a particular time, we did. We didn't. Maybe we weren't as free with our undertakings. But, sir, what we did was that when we made that, when we were seeking support, as the Prime Minister did, then, Mr Speaker, what we did was that we kept our word, because that was important. Mr Speaker, this bill changes employment law in a way that is not necessary. It was absolutely unnecessary. If this was a critical area, as the government claimed, why was Kate Wilkinson not at the negotiating table with Warners? Why was Kate Wilkinson not the lead negotiator when in fact Jerry Brownlee was actually doing the work and Stephen Joyce was doing the work? And I must say, I think it's a little bit sad for that pair that the person who ended up actually doing the work was Stephen Joyce. I also say that it is really interesting that Bill English promised there'd be no change in the law and no more money. No change in the law and no more money. And where was he today to answer the question on behalf of the Prime Minister? No more money and no change in the law, said Bill English. And I just want to say, I'm actually not at the point, because we don't know all the details yet about the money, criticising all of it, but because I think some of it was necessary. I am going to be very critical about a direct advertising subsidy to a US company. That is wrong. That is absolutely wrong, because it's not available to other New Zealand companies. It's a very uneven playing field. But I'm prepared to look.
How long a list do you want?
Want a list of what?
How long a list of companies that the Labor government preferred during their time in office?
I think never a US company over a New Zealand company in those circumstances. Never a US company with a specific arrangement like that over a New Zealand company. Mr Speaker, members opposite have been trying to say that this does not weaken the law. Well, why are they doing it? Who gains and who loses? Who gains and who loses? It strengthens the law on the part of employers, and I agree with Jerry Brownlee. This strengthens the law on the part of employers and reduces the protections that are available to people within New Zealand. Mr Speaker, there is very basic protections. There are very basic protections in New Zealand labour law, and one of the things that Warners told me when I worked with them was that they actually liked New Zealand labour law. And I'll tell the members why. And that is because we don't have the rigid occupational classifications that most Western countries do. And I'll give you an example. They often used to refer to set construction. And Mr Speaker, if in the United States, United Kingdom, most parts of Australia, and you're constructing a set and you use a hammer, you're not allowed to use a paintbrush. You use a hammer you can't use a paintbrush because one's the job of a painter and the other's the job of a carpenter. And while Mr Speaker might approve of that sort of arrangement, it's not one that we have had in New Zealand for a number of years. And what that means, and what Warner